Today's commercial real estate update, revisiting the playbook for retail, office, and corporate bonds post-COVID-19, is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. I'm Todd Schwartz, Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce, and I'll be your host today. We have over 70 registrants for today's event, so I'm sure we'll have a very vibrant discussion. One quick disclaimer. Please note that all comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. And now I'll hand it over to Yvonne Vendigo-Rothschild. She is my counterpart at the New York chapter of the EACC, and Yvonne can introduce our presenters and our topic. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you, Todd. Welcome to our commercial real estate update this morning. And Todd, as always, thank you for hosting. And I also want to thank my staff, Rick, for all the work they put into organizing and promoting the over 20 webinars we hosted since the pandemic. Femke has been hard at work with the over 50 panelists we featured in our programs during that time. Not an easy task. Today's webinar is an obvious choice. First of all, we always host a real estate program each year, but with the COVID pandemic, so much has changed, and we decided to do a program focusing on the economics of real estate. I think everyone is wondering when they will be back in the office, and we've all seen neighbors move out of buildings. And our panelists this morning, Anne-Marie DiCola, the CEO of Trepp, and Troy Merkel, partner of the real estate practice and senior analyst at RSM, will share what the future holds in Europe and in the US on commercial real estate. And Anne-Marie, with that, I hand over to you to set the stage for us this morning.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Yvonne and Todd. It is always a pleasure to work with the European American Chamber of Commerce. And also, Troy, it's been a pleasure to work with you on this panel and prepare for this. What we have for the audience today is an agenda that takes us through a bit of the macroeconomic effects of the onset of the pandemic and a look at the impact of those effects on commercial real estate in the US, both seen from the vantage point of data on bank loans as well as data on loans in commercial mortgage-backed bonds. And with that, a view of attenuating corporate credit issues that trickle down to commercial real estate as well. And in addition, Troy and I are going to focus specifically on what's happening in retail and office and what we may expect longer term from both of those particular sectors. So if we could move to the first slide, what we wanted to start with was an overview of some of the macroeconomic situation that we're looking at right now. And we're referring to, on these slides, the situation that occurred before and after the onset of the pandemic. There's a bit of yin and yang in all of these slides. If we look back to just a few months ago, when we were beginning this year, beginning a new decade, we were in a far more benign situation economically. If we look to the far left upper chart, we're looking at what's happened to US retail sales. And that's an example of some yin and yang. As soon as shutdowns began in the United States, we saw that retail sales plummeted. We weren't buying cars. We weren't making major clothing purchases. We weren't buying furniture. We were focusing on some household essentials. And then in this post-onset period, we started to experience some reopening around the country. And with that, we saw a surge in retail. We began to go out to dine or take out again. We began to do more purchasing. And some companies were benefiting from digital sales as well. But you see in that very precipitous metric there, the drop in retail sales and a pickup again as some reopening began. Throughout this presentation, a few of the words you're going to hear us use a few times are words like acceleration and velocity. And certainly there's been the velocity of the drop and the velocity of the rise is very, very precipitous there. If we look at the middle slide and the upper right slide, chart, thank you, on this first slide, we're taking a look there at some of the jobless claims. And there again, you see, once the shutdown began, the velocity of those claims that were filed. And interestingly, just before 9 a.m. this morning, the latest jobless claim numbers were reported, and those jobless claims have ticked up a bit higher since that last reported number as of July 18th. Another important metric that just came in this morning, just before 9 a.m., GDP was reported. You can see from the chart on the bottom of this slide that we were already projecting a steep drop in GDP for the second quarter of this year. And indeed, a record drop of GDP of 32.9% was just reported this morning, roughly an hour ago. So if we could move to the next slide, given this tough macroeconomic environment that we're in, what do we think is happening and will continue to happen in commercial real estate? And Trepp has a number of different databases and a number of different tools that we utilize in our tracking of the commercial real estate finance market. One of the databases that we have is a portfolio of 13,000 commercial real estate loans that we track that have been contributed by a number of US banks. We have applied our own default model to that data to project a 5-year cumulative default rate that we are projecting for these different property types. As you can see, based on our projections and our economic and real estate forecast scenario that we used, combines a combination of our unemployment rate assumptions, interest rate assumptions, property sector price and changes in NOI that we are assuming, and also loss severity numbers that we are utilizing based on what occurred in the Great Recession in the US from 08 to 10. And we project these cumulative default rates. We think there will be sustained problems in the lodging sector. But for today, we're going to particularly focus on what we see now and believe we will continue to see in retail and office. If we could move to the next slide. The previous slide was a focus that we made at Trepp and a scenario that we ran based on commercial mortgage loans held by banks. Now we're taking a look at our data set on commercial mortgage loans in CMBS. And there's a number of important points in this particular slide. When I look at this, before we focus on that velocity of increase in delinquency that you see to the right of this chart, I look at January of 2020, how benign things were in January of 2020. I was at a conference that's held annually in Miami by the Commercial Real Estate Finance Council, or CREFC, in the early part of January of this year. The word COVID, the word coronavirus was never mentioned. It wasn't on anyone's mind. It wasn't in our sights at that point. In fact, it was a very, very sanguine conference and one where people were expecting continued good news in the CRE finance sector for the next 3 to 4 years. We thought that we were in a run for commercial real estate where we were going to see overall good performance of loans, plenty of lending, plenty of opportunity. The only problem we noted was the continuing decline in retail, in certain types of retail properties. Look at the difference that a few months make. Couple of important stats on the right side of this slide. We mentioned the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010, and certainly there were many resulting problems in commercial real estate that came out as a result of that. The overall peak delinquency rate that we reported for loans in CMBS as a result of the Great Recession was 10.34%. We reported that in July of 2012, which was 4 years after the start of that recession. In June, last month, the overall rate of delinquency of loans in CMBS that we reported just in the last 4 months was only 2 basis points lower than the peak we reached after the Great Recession. That is an example of velocity of problems.
And Anne-Marie, tying that velocity back to the jobs, the same time period, the highest amount of jobs we lost in a single week back in the Great Recession was around 650,000 in that ballpark.
Yes.
We've continuously been losing 1.4 million and peaked in over 2 million job loss. So you've seen this in the chart. This precipitous and velocity that you keep referring to, it dwarfs what happened in the Great Recession.
Absolutely. And that's a theme that Troy and I are going to harken back to a number of times, because you'll see in our slides, we often take a look at what happened in the Great Recession, and we expect that we are going to see that and worse and quicker as well. Another important statistic I just want to mention here is that when you look at the statistic on office, that is actually a very modest delinquency rate on office. And one of the important topics we're going to talk about is what problems loom under what appear to be good statistics for office. What problems really exist for the future of office? One other mention I want to make is we're going to be reporting later today our overall delinquency rate for CMBS loans for the month of July. And we're going to be reporting a lower delinquency rate than 10.32%, which is what we reported for June. But when we do that, that is a function of many loans being given forbearance, extensions, modifications, forms of relief that servicers have been feverishly working on with borrowers to try to relieve their pressures. And as a result of that, of that relief being granted, many of those loans officially get moved from being marked as delinquent to being marked as current, which is good, but still something to watch. The hoped for result is that the short form relief that many borrowers of commercial real estate loans are being given today will turn into a longer term ability to stay on track. But what the message really is, don't think that just because you may see a technical delinquency rate dropping, that these properties and loans are out of the woods for the long term. Okay. We can move to the next slide. To the point that Troy brought up earlier, here's an example of comparing CMBS delinquency rates since the great financial crisis and now. And there again, there's velocity and precipitous delinquency happening. We certainly saw delinquencies as a result of the Great Recession, but frankly, they were more gradual. Look at the spike when we look at what has just happened all the way on the far right of this slide. And we can move to the next slide. As we think about the future, another of the many statistics we track at Trepp is NOI growth in properties and year-over-year growth. And this is a look at what happened to plummeting NOI during the Great Recession. We don't yet have all the statistics to fill this out for the current situation. When we do, our thesis at this time is that we will see a steeper drop and a faster drop relative to this period than we saw for NOI as a result of the Great Recession. When we talk about some good news on this slide, one thing to point out is what had been having good NOI growth rates in recent years. And the purple line is industrial properties. And as we think about predictions here, we see that industrial had a high NOI growth rate in recent years, and we expect that that will continue since industrial is in high demand these days, given the increase in online sales and the need for the warehousing and distribution capability that industrial properties provide. Moving on to the next slide, we're taking a look now at all corporate and leveraged loans globally. And these include corporate credit CLOs. And again, there's an interesting thing to point out here. If you look at the far left of this slide, you see that there was a spike in these type of loan defaults as a result of the Great Recession. Once again, data is not yet fully available to track all of this for this current period, but when we do, we expect to see a spike. Now, an interesting element of corporate credit CLOs is they have generally been performing better than the overall market. But an important takeaway from today's conversation is they're definitely not immune from problems. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that corporate credit and analyzing corporate credit is very much a function of looking at the sector of which it's a part, and also then looking at the accompanying commercial real estate that's impacted by that. No secret here on retail. We know retail has been having a problem, and in recent months, even more major retailers filed for bankruptcy. Every time a major retailer does so, corporate commercial real estate is impacted. These are department stores. These are often anchor tenants in shopping malls. So the corporate credit issues of retailers having direct ramifications for commercial real estate. If you look in the middle column with the energy sector, the downward push in oil prices certainly has impacted energy companies, and we have many that have been filing for bankruptcy. And also realize in the US, the energy industry is often concentrated very regionally, and therefore the impact of that industry centralization in particular geographies bodes many problems for commercial real estate when this happens. Every time you think of another energy company that files for bankruptcy, just imagine what that does for markets like Houston, Texas. On the flip side, and here's more yin and yang, the technology sector has been performing much better through all of this. We know that, as Troy is going to elaborate, the increased use of technology by all of us is just one way that the whole tech sector has been aided. You have companies like Rackspace, which has about $870 million in CLO exposure, planning to launch an IPO. So on the technology side, you see high performance, you see strong corporate credit CLOs that have technology, and again, important impacts on the accompanying real estate. At Trepp, we can zero into specific MSAs and look at delinquency and defaults in different cities. And if you compare a city like San Francisco, which is very, very tech heavy, to delinquency rates in New York, which has some tech but is not as tech heavy as San Francisco, the delinquency rate overall in New York is much higher. So impacts of corporate credit impacting commercial real estate, both positively and negatively. Okay. With that, I know that Troy is going to take us through some of the highlights of what's been happening in the capital markets. So Troy, please proceed.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And very similar trends occurring in the capital markets here for real estate is there's a lot of uncertainty among investors about what asset classes they should be going into, where they should be investing geographically. The only one that seems to be semi-immune, as you pointed out, is industrial, and to a lesser extent, multifamily and even single-family investment. But the rest of the office, retail, and other traditional real estate investments have investors very worried. As such, you've seen a precipitous fall in the fundraising activity that's happened over the last couple quarters. You can see Q4 2019, similar to what Anne-Marie was speaking about. I was at a conference too, when we used to do those things, end of January, and we were talking about a record year in 2020 for real estate. There were a number of funds that were coming due. There was going to be activity and transactions moving. Capital had a great quarter, an all-time high there. I mean, you typically see late quarter surges in capital fundraising. And there was a trend line that had continued since the Great Recession. Really starting in 2013, there was some pausing after the Great Recession, but it had trended up continuously with some eradication here because of the quarterly reporting. And the same has held true in Europe. There was a greater dip in the number of capital, or the amount of capital raised in Europe in the end of 2019, but that peaked up in Q2 of 2020. So there's a lag there. Again, there's some volatility in this data due to the quarterly reporting, but because of the environment we're in, I normally wouldn't show this on a quarterly. I used to show it on an annual trend, Anne-Marie. I think all our data we used to be able to do annual, and now quarterly almost doesn't feel right. It almost needs to be monthly or weekly in some cases.
Right.
Yeah. And so it gets challenging when we all of a sudden take these metrics like fundraising, which is a long, pronounced period, and we're trying to predict trends in a very dramatic time where we've had what is truly, a shocking event to the market. Absolutely. And it's something that we're working through, and everybody is trying to figure out what's next. And we'll talk a little bit about that with some of the office and retail asset classes. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, as fundraising has become a challenge, there's still a significant amount of dry powder, and this has been occurring over time as there's been an accumulation as investors have sought real estate as a great asset during this time. The last 10 years, anyone who made an investment in real estate, you likely did pretty well. It was very hard no matter what MSA, no matter what asset you were in. Now, there's obviously a couple losers here or there, but on the whole, everything rose, and as such, money continued to drive that way to seek yield. And so we've seen powder and the money coming in, but deal flow has been a challenge. Deal flow, if you draw a through line and a trend line, has remained relatively constant while fundraising had increased over the last 10 years. And that's what's led to this excess of capital sitting on the sidelines. But as you can see here, deal flow has plummeted, has completely fallen off the map. And partly because there's a complete disconnect between buyers and sellers. As Anne-Marie pointed out, there is distress in the market, but some of the distress, especially when you look at the delinquency rates of the office market, it isn't coming through yet. And so owners aren't necessarily feeling distressed. And there may be some denial out there about what's coming. On the retail side, there is distress, but at the same time, they're saying this is a shock event. I'm not going to sell low. So while buyers are out there and they have raised funds and they have capital sitting on the sideline to buy, there's never been a greater disconnect between buyer and sellers in the marketplace than there is right now. And that is halting transactions, compounded by the fact that we haven't had to transact in this type of environment ever, where we can't meet face to face. The real estate market has still always been a very intimate buy-sell process. There's table negotiations, there's due diligence process, there's meetings upon meetings with all the various stakeholders of not just buy-sell, but lenders come into play. Oftentimes, if there's going to be redevelopment, architects, design, permitting needs to be completed. It's very, very difficult if you're trying to work through any of those situations that were never designed to work remote. And in many ways, we're more antiquated than many other industries. When you look at what we've, we'll get there. I think we're going to ultimately jump maybe a decade in what we need for technology, basically on necessity. I mean, when you think about the home buying market, which happens at a larger volume, is direct to consumers who are not traditional real estate buyers. So There needs to be a better thought about consumer process. We're seeing things, especially that the lenders have been doing over the time and buy and sell through apps like Redfin and Zillow that are going to continue. So making it easier, using a digital platform to close, linking together the chain of all the players and vendors that need to be involved in a close process of a house is going to have to start to translate into office and industrial and multifamily to get deal flow going again. And that may be something that we end up keeping because of convenience. And I think that's something that's going to be a continuous theme. Right now, we are living in fear. There's a fear that is driving the economic, the business, the political decisions that are happening across the world. And that fear, while justified, will dissipate eventually. We as humans, we move on. We've had plagues in the past, pandemics, just wars, destruction, and we march forward. And we will do that again. But there's things that are going to be born out of this, just like any other major event that impacts the world. You look at the technology and the business and the social advances that happen post a world war or post a pandemic, and you see that we're forever changed, and it's things that continue beyond that. And we're going to start talking a little bit about this, and this is where we're going to get into a bit of a dialogue, as Anne-Marie and I have a lot of great thoughts about this, and we're prognosticating, right? We've been talking about what's happening in the markets. It's very concrete. That's where we're generally comfortable, right? And we know what we're talking about here, although, you know, black swan events like this throw us for a little bit of a loop.
Absolutely.
But if we pivot to retail, things have accelerated in retail. You know, the idea of going out, getting all your packages, doing the shopping center and going back to your car and then going home has become quickly antiquated. And now you're not even buying the idea of buying on a computer. You're buying on your phone. We're buying most of your stuff. My wife and I, we have 3 young children. We have been quarantined. We just finally got them going back to daycare and school the last couple of weeks after 4 months of being home. We've converted grocery shopping online. We're probably going to do that going forward because I love it. The grocery app, it tells me how many hours I've saved on shopping, and it's just timing that great young 20-something that can run around and how long it took them. And I go, you do that with 3 kids. And even so, after Sunday service, trust me, it's like 4 times what you're giving me as an estimate. And so there's those choices out of convenience that I think are going to forever change us. And Emery, we've talked about this. What are some of the other things that you've thought about with retail that's going to, these things are going to be long lasting?
Absolutely. I think that what's really remarkable about this is we know that retail was already experiencing issues and already experiencing a problem. But I think pre-COVID, one of the estimates I heard was that online retail buying accounted for still under 10% of purchases in the US. That number has risen exponentially as a result of the onset of the pandemic. And I know for a fact from my own network that people I know who never bought online are buying online constantly now. And people that already were online purchases are doing even more. So there were many people that bought lots of stuff online, but they had never bought groceries online. And now, as Todd pointed out, the time-saving nature of it and the safety of it, that you're not going out, you're not engaging, you're not worrying about how close you are with other people, is another element that's feeding into this. And we haven't been at this for just a week or two. It's been months now.
Right.
And that is a time period that changes personal habits in a big way.
Yeah,
so,
no.
Right?
Absolutely. And again, this was a trend that we had going. And that's what I start looking at when I look at a pandemic, or I look at this black swan, or I looked at the Great Recession. I look at, okay, what were trends that maybe were happening that now become out of necessity? Necessity breeds innovation, and so now we're moving faster with that. And you look at retail e-commerce sales, and they were continuing to grow already, and they're now going. When we see the 2020 numbers, that is going to shoot up through the roof. Especially when you look at the omni-channel approach that some of the major retailers, especially here in the U.S., such as Target, Walmart, Best Buy, etc., got up and running. I mean, I remember stories with Best Buy. When this all started happening, I had clients who, they didn't have laptops for everybody. So Best Buy distribution chain to provide laptops was a critical piece of infrastructure that nobody thought about before. And all of a sudden, moving to their leveraging their online platform became extremely important. And the other one, you know, Emery, you mentioned things that you didn't buy. Groceries are one that they were thought, if you have a Whole Foods, or up here in the Northeast, a Stop and Shop or a Shaw, you know, one of these anchor supermarkets, you're fine. Everyone's going to want to, you know, go in there, touch the fruit, look at the meat, you know, smell the flowers in the, you know, in the floor shop, smell the bakery bread.
Absolutely.
But then we got forced to not do it. And then we said, oh, wait, this is nice. I've got a couple hours back in my time. Now, there were definitely kinks in the system. There were challenges getting supply. I mean, there was infamous shortages of toilet paper, for instance, partially because of consumer buying, but mostly because supply chain distribution completely shifted. People were spending 100% of the time in their home when they were spending 60, 70% of their waking hours in offices. So the supply channels all had to be reconnected and redistributed. But after 4 months, to your point, this wasn't when we first did this, I don't know about you, I thought, okay, we'll do this for a couple weeks and then we'll be back, right? And then a couple weeks turned into a month or two, and then we were 4 months in, and it was shocking. And now things have become the next normal, if we want to call it that, or where we're at.
That's a good phrase.
You know, yeah, and then, you know, before we switch over to the delinquency, one thing I want to tee that up with as we kind of link it back from the jobs report is, you know, when we look at some leading indicators, especially with these types of Black Swan events, we're forced to look at alternative data sources. So one of the ones we've been tracking is Yelp. And one of the things that Yelp has told us with regards to retailers, especially when you look at these small to mid-sized retailers that populate all our main streets, 150,000 of them were reported as closed in July, and 55% of those are deemed permanently closed. So when we look at those job loss numbers, and while they actually dipped a little bit 2 weeks ago before rising again here, if you looked at permanent job loss numbers, they actually had continued to climb. It was a lot of the furloughs and the temporary job losses that were coming back. So it's going to be a long slug to get back these jobs. And there's been such a steep drop in the job loss, and so that's going to continue to accelerate, as Amory mentioned, and going to continue that velocity. I love using that word in these times. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to you to talk a little bit about, you know, what's going on with the delinquency rate here in retail.
Certainly. Well, apropos of all of these changes in our habits necessitated by the onset and then deepening as the pandemic continues in a very protracted way. Completely agree, Troy. We thought this was going to be for a few weeks, and now we're at a few months and no end in sight. So as a result, if you look at this slide, you see the precipitous rise of retail delinquencies. This is tracking CMBS loans backed by retail properties. The worst performing have been shopping malls, and this situation has only exacerbated that. But a couple of pieces of good news, okay? If you say, you know, what retail is doing well, two of the better performing areas of retail, and it ties into our newly found increased preference for online. Convenience centers and urban street retail have actually been performing better, and we expect that they will continue to do so for the very same reasons that we like online. You know, the standalone Rite Aid or Walgreens or CVS, that convenience center that has so many odds and ends that we need, so many essentials, everything from pharmacy to some milk to some other personal care items to paper products, are all there. And that is typically not very far from home. And as convenient as online is, you can get this even faster. Those are performing well, and they've stayed open throughout this period, and they've provided essential needs. In addition, urban and street retail, again, what's handy to the immediate dwellers in an urban neighborhood, those have also been performing well also. but in general for retail, a very, very difficult issue with delinquency. If we look at the next slide and we look at reported occupancy, this is one of those slides where the data is not in yet. The data on this lags, but if we take a look back to what happened during the Great Recession in 08 and 10 and after, this is a chart that's showing the average monthly occupancy rate that was reported on all outstanding retail CMBS loans for a given year. And, you know, as you can see, a big dip on reported occupancy as a result of the Great Recession, and levels that slightly improved post the recession, but still have been trending down since 2015. That's what Troy and I referenced as problems that were already existing in retail. When we have the lagged data that comes in on this, we're very confident that this downward occupancy trend for retail is going to continue. Bright spots again, the convenience center and the urban retail, the urban on-street retail.
Yeah, we're going to shift now over to sort of what is the post-COVID office look like? And this one is going to be an interesting one because, as you pointed out, Emery, the fault lines don't seem to be there yet, right? The delinquency hasn't been there. Occupancy, rent collections have stayed strong.
Correct.
The
Correct.
occupancy numbers are
Yes.
deceivingly strong, although I've
Yes.
seen some facts that people believe there's anywhere from 15 to 20% of some businesses or space has been vacated that may never come back. You know, speaking of such, like
Yes.
EA, CCNY here in Cincinnati, they had 4 cubes that they leased in an office there. They are now virtual.
Right.
Ourselves, you know, in our offices across the country, we had people in office for production purposes, administration, and things like that had always taken office space, but we found they work just as well and are happier with flexibility they
Right.
never had before. They always came in from they did the 8:30 to 5:30 every day coming into
Right.
the offices, and
Absolutely.
most of our offices are all main areas. I mean, our New York office is literally Times Square. It's 4
Right.
Times Square. So
Right.
you know, we have people making these commutes and these challenging inflexible schedules work for them. When we found out, hey, they don't need to. So we've looked at that workforce and we've said, you are welcome to work remote permanently.
Exactly.
And that's
Right.
going to be changing how we use office. And then, another thing we looked at with, you look at some of the spaces that have been created over time. So some of like the Google campuses, which have cost billions and have created these amazing collaborative spaces. Now we look at, well, what's the future spend look like that?
Exactly.
Now, I actually think it's going to be an acceleration of that idea that Google had, in that more collaborative space, less me space. Because if you need me space, they have the concept of we space or me space. So the we being our conference centers, our touchdown areas, our cafes, things like that.
Exactly.
Versus the me space, which was our cubicles, our offices. Now, again, this is where we need to get past the fear and look at the convenience and the shifts and dynamics that were already happening and how they may have been accelerated. The fear-based person is looking at it and saying, well, we're going to need more space. We're going to need closed off offices. So this is going to be a boon for office. And you take a step back and, reading a McKinsey report this weekend, they were talking about, we need to think, do people come to the work, or does the work come to the people? Do we need to reimagine that? And if so, do we need to also reimagine the office, which really hasn't been radically changed, outside of some of the crazy Google campuses, for 100 years? It was usually cubes above a factory that made something, and the cubes facilitated the administrators and the managers that facilitated the factory. And that's completely being looked at differently. And can we work remote? And when we do go to the office, what do we want to do in the office? Emery, if you're going to go back to the office, are you going to go sit in your office, or what do you want to do when you get back to the office?
Exactly. Well, I love your use of the word reimagine, because I think that companies everywhere now are really rethinking what is the role of our office in our company? What is the role of our office in achieving our strategy What role does the office play in our culture now? And how is it different? I know from my own network of business associates, friends, family, the amount of converts to the idea that working remotely can be hugely productive. People who were never keen on the idea of people working from home have now gone 180 degrees differently and said, wow, working from home can be super productive, which of course leaves open the question, what do we do about the office space? Completely agree, in a safer world, about the difference between the me space and the we space. And the interesting thing about office is that there were some subtle changes that were taking place in office. Over the last few years, the increased use of the open design concept in offices, which many companies were adopting, interestingly, always resulted in the company leasing less space. So one of the trends that was occurring under the data for office was that if many more places adopted the very collaborative open design, who was going to lease the excess space that was no longer needed when you didn't have as many individual bulky offices lining the windows? That was one trend. And another interesting trend is this. In recent years, we have become aware of some global corporations that actually wanted to reduce the amount of their lease space. And they were beginning selectively to cut their space in half in certain ways over a period of years by having employees share a workspace and split the month or the week by working partly from home and partly in the office. And that some large corporations were doing that. So we had wondered if a slow, gradual change in office was beginning to happen. Now, again, on the theme of acceleration and velocity, this forced shutdown and everyone working from home, we think has accelerated the reimagining of the office that every company is thinking about right now.
Yeah, and it's not going to continue because of fear. You know, when we look, and I'm just going to pop another quick slide back up here.
Right.
You know, when we interview people, if they can work, if they had their choice, would they want to work from home? And they would. They enjoy the flexibility they get. Now, this is a privilege shared by many of the white collar workers, many of the knowledge workers, the people that have the capabilities to remote in. So it's not all workforce, but when you're looking at office, I mean, that is it. I mean, I work for a CPA firm. We are your dream office tenant. We're relatively, recession proof. People always have to pay their taxes and get audits done. If anything, that compliance level goes up during that period.
Exactly.
Our consultancy wax and wanes maybe a little bit, but we're pretty resilient, and we take a lot of headcount, and we don't want to really own our real estate. So, but every office that we've been moving into in every major metro, I talked about our New York office, our Boston office, we're moving in our Chicago office. Every time we have gone with more people to less space with each new office, because people had already been working that sort of semi-flex week.
Absolutely.
And some of the data, and this is a 2019 survey, so it kind of goes back to like this was a trend, was showing that the sweet spot was sort of that 60 to 80% work remote, and that you still had the highest level of engagement then, the lower level of not engaged, and this actively disengaged. I love that. I can't imagine just being actively disengaged with work. That's what you need to go find. Yeah, exactly. It's weird, but anyways, think about it though. You think about the psychology of it for a few things.
Absolutely.
One, we're always on, right? We have mobile devices. We feel always connected to work. So why can't we get some of the benefit? It's almost like for the last decade, we've leveraged that technology. And from a worker perspective, it's been a con. It's been, I work more hours. I'm always on. I don't get any of the benefits. So I go to the office from 8:30 to 5:30 if you're lucky. And then you go home, but then you're answering emails on your phone while you're sitting there watching Netflix with your spouse. And so you never really got the benefit of that. So now, and especially if we start to have, competitiveness, and we're concerned about transfer of labor and things like that, people are going to demand it. And
Right.
when you think psychologically, right? When you work with somebody 5 days a week in the same office space right next to them, that you might like that person, but you're not actively engaged in everything they say. You start to tune it out, right? You start to go, okay, yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. Like, it becomes, but if I only see you once a week, if Anne-Marie and I only get together live once a week with our team for an hour or two to get through stuff, we are coming in focused because we got stuff that we have to get done, and I'm not going to see you again for
Exactly.
4 days. And so
Exactly.
there is a logic behind that makes that make sense. And those numbers make
Absolutely.
sense.
And one of the things you mentioned earlier, which we have in our statistics, is the fact that right now, delinquencies in office properties in CMBS, as one example, extremely modest. We don't have yet all the data on reported occupancy rates. Certainly as a result of the Great Recession, occupancy rates in office properties in CMBS certainly dropped. We expect that that is a trend that we're going to continue to see go negative, because we do think that the real issue for office will be when that lease is up for renewal, whether that company will renew for the same amount of space, less space, or renew at all. And every business leader right now is taking a look at that contractual obligation, and they're looking at that fixed cost, and they're absolutely rethinking, reimagining longer term what they should do. So although we're reporting good news right now on office delinquency, relatively modest delinquencies in office right now, we do know that these offices are not being occupied. And we do expect that the office sector is going to undergo significant disruption and change in the coming years.
Yeah, and one of the slides here, and I know I'm leveraging your slide, but you can see here the one office sector that has been okay has been suburban, and we've seen that a move to suburban. And in some cases, it's temporary. We're seeing short-term leases, 18 to 24-month lease signed, because corporate headquarters that have been downtown areas in high rises. I was talking to one of my partners. He lives in a 2,000 person building in New York City. He moved out to an extended stay closer to his golf course for the summer because it would take so long for them to get up and down the elevator because they were only allowing 1 or 2 people at a time, that he said, what am I doing here? And so we're seeing that, looking at 4-story walkable where people can drive and park because of the public transportation. So that's a short-term shift. But what we may see from a longer-term shift, and we're seeing that in some of, when we look at housing data, is that people are searching and buying outside the urban core. We had a pent-up demand with interest rates so low; they're below 3% right now, record low for the 30-year, and 20% spike in existing home sales this past month. And if you look at it, there's been, tracking again some of those alternative housing search data points, there's been a 10 to 15% bump in the number of people within urban core searching for suburbs. So when these people make that long-term move and they're looking at like, well, if I might be working remote for a little bit, I want a little bit more space because now my office became my home became my office.
Exactly.
We may continue to see this trend.
Absolutely. The same way we found some bright spots in certain types of retail, like the convenience center. There's the bright spot in office right now is suburban office, which ironically had been on a decline for the last several years. And now it's having an uptick for all of those reasons. Absolutely. I know of some companies that are considering not renewing their larger headquarters in a metropolitan city, but having satellite locations in the suburban areas where they could have pockets of employees.
Right. And yeah, that kind of touches upon some of the questions, we've had here. They talk about, what are the challenges of working in a metropolitan area and working from home? It doesn't work as well. And then there is a question here about the densification and the idea that we're now going to go to move away from these collaborative areas. I just don't see that happening because when we subside the fear, and we will, we have done that before, when we get this pandemic under control, and when we start to move forward in an intelligent way, we're going to look at what's best for the business and what's best for the people.
Yes.
Again, people have been asking. It's been top 3 for a decade and top 1 for the last 5 years. When you survey employees, flexibility is one of the top demands that everybody has want, and they're going to continue to see that, especially when they get the flexibility in their personal life. And then when you look at the office space, average in the US, now this includes the suburban and urban core markets, is about 11,000 per employee per year that companies spend. And so companies are going to look at this and say, why are we doing this? And in many cases, it's because they were never forced to make that decision. As Emery mentioned, the average office lease is about 6 years. So for instance, our own firm, we used to go from our production team, our administrative team was all based on your local geo. You have people in your office and that's who service you. A couple years ago, we moved to, okay, well, could we do a ticketing system and leverage, we have offices in the East Coast and the West Coast. It gives us more hours of operation for that group. So we went to that. And then we moved it to a pure virtual ticketing system. And so we gradually moved there, but we had the office space and we never saw a reason to make a shift. But now people are rethinking everything. And they're going to look for cost cutting. They're going to look for resiliency. You're going to look to mitigate fixed costs. And the employees are going to say, wait, why do I was productive. I got stuff done. Why do I have to go back? And then the last thing we need to think about, from the fear of and where this is going from the long term that we haven't talked about is, and I'm acutely aware of, is what's going to happen with the schooling systems. And we've seen this already, EACC and why they're planning on going back once the schools go back to their offices. But then you look at some of the tech companies out in California, where I think about 80% of California is going to be remote work for the most, or remote schooling, I'm sorry, for the most part. They've already said, look, through the school year. They picked June. June wasn't arbitrary. It was through the school year because working parents, even if you go, my town is contemplating a hybrid model, which is going to be 1 week in school and then 1 week virtual. Well, what do I do that virtual week with my 6-year-old? I got to be home, or my wife has to be home. And so we're going to continue to work in this, and we're going to get better at it. And then it's going to come down to convenience. So when we come back and the pandemic has resided and the fear has resided, we're going to go, what was convenient? What did the worker want? And then the business owner is going to go, what's the best business decision for my bottom line and to keep productivity? And I think that's going to lead to this hybrid model where some might work from home permanently, others will work from home occasionally, and the office space is going to be reserved, to your point about what drives my business forward: training, connectivity, collaboration. That's what we needed the office for.
We've heard of models that companies are already thinking about that allow for a degree of working from home, absolutely, and then highlight certain days of the week or month that they would like to try for a critical mass of employees, for cross-team meetings, for corporate town halls, for company events, and things that bring people together. But for the individual workloads of individual people, not a requirement that they be sitting in the office to get that work done. So a sea change coming, a sea change in the way we work and where we work. And so that's something to think about when people look at office statistics. They seem benign today, but there's a big change coming. Absolutely.
And then just 2 other points, and there's a question here that I do want to answer. One point though that we also were already going to see with the de-densification or the densification of office or the reduction of need is population shifts. So the last 10 years, office population has increased between 2 and 2.5%, while U.S. populations increased about 0.7%. And what was driving that was the 2 largest generations, boomers and millennials, were in the office together. Mom and dad were learning to work with their kids. And then, because boomers were working later, and that's where millennials had joined the workforce. Well, Generation Z in the US, globally, Generation Z is bigger than the millennial generation. But in the US, it's about 25 million people less. And Gen Z, the oldest Gen Zs are in their mid-20s right now. So that's the population that's coming to consume the office space as boomers retire. And Gen Z is natively mobile. They grew up
Mhm.
with mobile devices and everything.
Absolutely.
So this idea that you're tied to a location, and they are driving some of the gig economy concepts. Like this idea that I need to be tied to work and work can't come to me is not something they embrace.
Absolutely.
And one of the questions in here was regarding office spaces and are people trying to break leases and with people working from home permanently. There are people trying to negotiate out of leases. I have not seen clients have issues where people are trying to completely break their leases because, again, there is an element, office plays a role. One, you need to
Yes.
be able to host clients, you need to be able to collaborate with each other in a physical environment. And then also, Anne Marie and myself, we're experienced in our career. We've done this. We know what we have, our connections, our relationships. We hop on the Zoom. We know people. We have a long working history. We're onboarding people all the time. We just wrapped up our intern program. I did a webinar lunch program with the intern. We need a place to train those people. So some of our
Yes.
junior people are still going to have to come into the office. So
Agreed.
people aren't breaking their leases because that's such a
Correct.
bad track record and it'll be hard for them to get the space they need.
Right.
They are reimagining, rethinking, and speaking with their landlords about what should be the future of their office.
Absolutely. Definitely.
With that, Anne Marie, I don't know if you had any last parting thoughts. I will throw the slides up for one last share of our screen faces and everything.
Yes, I think that the overriding message is expect a change, look for the opportunity, look for the opportunities to reinvent and reimagine. One of the phrases I always had heard in the Great Recession was a crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste. And in all of this change, I would encourage embracing the reality of change and reinventing and using creativity and courage as you address these issues.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Todd, I got nothing to add. I'll pass it back to you and Yvonne to take us away.
Thank you very much. Great discussion, both of you. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much. That concludes today's webinar, Commercial Real Estate Update, Revisiting the Playbook for Retail, Office, and Corporate Bonds Post-COVID-19. Thanks, of course, to our presenters, Anne Marie DeCola and Troy Merkel, for sharing your experience and your insight. And of course, thanks to our audience for joining us today and for joining us in our discussion. Just a reminder, all comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. Please stay in touch with your local chapter of the EACC for information on upcoming webinars and events. Be reminded that a copy of the slides as well as a link to the recording of this video will be shared with you, and the video will be posted on our EACC YouTube channel in the near future. And joining you from my home office here in the suburbs of Cincinnati, Ohio, I say to you farewell. Thanks again.
Bye all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.